how do you view current student engagement with the design process, and what are your thoughts on how important the embedding of a idea development strategy is to a fledgling designer or illustrator?
I think in the context of the foundation group, foundation students, and possibly the first years as well, it's really interesting what you've done with these students. I think the problem that we continue to work with is that we assume that students come into is actually interested in the subject area, and I think that's reading what you've written here. I think part of what we're dealing with is actually a body of students who are actually they're not engaged by the subject yet.
Yeah.
So to look at one part of the subject is useful, and particularly within the context of what you're looking at, and it's a key element of what a designer is.
Yes.
And essentially what you've got here is, the recognition that design process is a series of choices, a series of decisions, and you've got to have things to make decisions about.
Yeah.
They're always going to fall down when they chase an outcome from the word go, which again is what you've identified and what we experience. So I think initially the engagement with the process has to follow the engagement with the subject, and perhaps the two can be linked together somewhere, which was one of the questions I had remaining from what you had there. Although obviously you've been looking at one particular area and delving into that.
Well, that's certainly.
Sorry, is that still going, or is it just on a sleep mode?
Yes, I think it is.
Oh, right, okay.
I hope it is anyway. Yes, it is. That's certainly something that when I conduct further research and further investigate further, it's something that I need to really bring into the implications of how, and the possibly tweak my methodology so that it encompasses that initial engagement with the subject prior to then saying, right, this is how the subject is then broken down. This is what it is. How can I make you excited about it? Right, let's then go on and be excited about the work we're going to do.
Figure out how you do that sort of work.
Yeah, exactly.
That you're so excited about. Yeah, I mean I mean we're already looking at this in terms of how we replan year zero, foundation year anyway. So this is a really useful element of that, and a key element, because I think that very first bit of process that you've looked at is the key to everything else. And again, you've sort of identified that with individual students, where they're chasing an outcome, it tends to be less successful.
Yeah.
If they just enter into an exploratory process, it becomes more successful, and I think more fulfilling for the student as well. And certainly, from our point of view, we find that, don't we? That
absolutely.
When you're certain about stuff, it's the danger is that the design process becomes a routine.
Yes.
And then it gets boring.
Yes.
For you and for the people who are viewing your work, it comes through in your work. So it's that it really is that exploratory process is the way that you keep it exciting and interesting, and you end up with different things.
So that's the key to the engagement, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So being Sherlock.
Yeah.
Is,
I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's certainly one of the key paths in, isn't it? The improvements the interventions that I introduced, the enhancing of the mentoring scheme and the brainstorming lecture. Obviously, I was asked to look at very small improvements, but they're just part of the toolkit that we all employ. And it was just a case of taking one or two things and enhancing
strengthening them.
Yeah.
I think particularly the mentoring process I think is really, really useful and for both students.
Absolutely. Yes, the benefits for the year threes as well as the year zeros are, that.
Well, I think by the time they get to year three, fingers crossed,
particularly the ones who have been through year zero.
Yeah, the process is embedded. They're at a stage where they're almost not thinking about process anymore. It's a natural, if not an habitual, hopefully not habitual process.
Yeah.
So I think to come back and start to explain it to other students and justify it to other students is incredibly useful for the third years because they then start to look at the journey they've come on.
Yeah.
So that makes, it gives them a boost. But also I think that rationalisation of what they do is useful in terms of their continuing education.
Absolutely.
So it refocuses them as well as hopefully the year zero student too.
The negative aspects of the mentoring, if there can really be any that they highlighted during my questioning my research, was that they found it a little overwhelming and at first, and so what I'm going to try and introduce with further mentoring schemes is that the relationship between the mentors and the mentees is possibly more concrete is more built rather than sort of, hi, here's Sophie, and here she's off to show you her work. So maybe there's a better sort of ice breaking partnership building bit that comes prior to that.
I think one of the things we should have a look at here is actually not the third years mentoring the year zero students, but the year three students teaching the year three students, so that they're actually running a project or running projects and working with the year zeros all the way through. That sort of more collaborative approach, rather than something, here's my work, isn't it fantastic?
Yes,
you'll be doing this in 3-4 years' time, don't worry about
while
it.
they sit there going...
It's easy to say that, but when you're at the other end of that scale, you might not be totally gripped by the work area at this time, all those sorts of things. That I think actually working alongside an experienced student or a more experienced student has loads of benefits. For both sets of students. So I think that's definitely something we should have a look at. Off the back of that, it seemed when I was reading through it, it sort of kept coming to the fore of my mind, thinking, okay, well that would be one way of actually securing a more equitable experience, because it's not about sort of being overwhelmed by something, it's about working on something with somebody else, which is I think an easier
it is, becomes more collaborative, without a doubt. The thing that sort of surprised me whilst I was working through my action research was, whilst initially I approached the assignment seeing it as a box to tick, because on the whole, and I hope I'm speaking for all of us, I'm not speaking out of turn, we generally see ourselves as teachers who don't necessarily view research as key to our pedagogy, because we're all very much practitioners. And that's the thing that surprised me most, in that actually action research is the design process. It's what we do. It's an intrinsic part of this sort of cyclical understanding of a client or a project or a design problem, and coming to a solution and then reflecting on that. That kind of cyclical process, that system, is what we do anyway, and we just don't really recognise. We take it for granted, and that was really quite revealing to me. And I found that acknowledgement of research as being something that wasn't done by very clever academic types, but actually it was done by me.
Yes, yeah.
And it was just that I wasn't consciously aware of it. And I found that really quite valuable, that sudden sort of eureka realisation. And that kind of leads me on to how we then share good practice, share eureka moments within our course team. We work so closely, we work so collaboratively, and we all teach on all of the levels.
Yeah. And that's the danger.
Because there is little structure.
Yeah, in terms of bringing new things to the table, it tends to be fairly ad hoc. This is something that I want to change. I want to build in those spaces so that we have a more planned and a way of us bringing our new ideas to the table for discussion, rather than feeling that we have to leave them in somewhere to test them out.
Absolutely.
So I think that's definitely something that we want to build that time in.
That's the thing, isn't it, though? Because we all spend our time teaching and assessing.
We do.
We rarely build time in to reflect on and to share and disseminate.
I think that's the other thing that we have to get to grips with, though, is that I've been trying to sort of like lever it in a bit over the year, is that I think in terms of the amount of time we spend teaching and assessing, we need to throw some of that onus back on the students. Now, it might not be appropriate for year 0 students.
Yeah, absolutely.
We might need. I think it's about different years and different experiences, and letting the students take more control. Where I think as teachers we're frightened to relinquish that control because we're worried about what the results will be.
Yes.
I think we've got to have more faith in the students, particularly in the later years. We've got to have more faith in the students to manage their own learning, if you like, or certainly to contribute far more to the planning of that learning, or to the implications of actually what it will be. And that this is something that we're working on now in years 2 and 3 is removing teaching content from projects. So the project becomes a test of the teaching rather than just a project to do, which I think is a fairly common failing in art and design education, is that I think a lot of the time students are, I don't particularly mean here, I think we're quite aware of this, but in other institutions, certainly ones that I've visited as an external, that projects are thrown at students without any real sort of consideration as to what they're meant to be learning.
Yes.
So it's like, oh yeah, let's do a corporate identity project because we haven't done one.
Yes.
And so obviously the reflective practice is the essence of what we do as designers, and that's what we're trying to instill in our students. But we never really talk about it. We never really talk about the mechanics of it. We talk about it in relation to projects. That's a really hard step to take for us because of our experiences up to this date, really.
Yeah.
But I think that's what I'm trying to encourage, that particularly 2nd and 3rd year, and also to pull this space aside so that we've got time to engage in research.
Yes.
We can't do that while we teach. I think we're straying off the point here, aren't we? But I think we can't do that until we recognise we can't expect the same things from the students.
Yeah.
The same level or number of outcomes from students. Perhaps they're in more depth, but perhaps they'll feel like they've learned more.
Even though it's strayed off the point, it actually was pertinent to what I've been doing.
Absolutely, and that's I think that's the danger of I don't know the MA programme, but the danger of this sort of like critical theory research is it does sort of force you into a narrow area. And actually what we've got is a holistic teaching approach.
Yes.
And so to fiddle with one area has a big impact elsewhere. And it's, you've taken an area that's sort of like a key start of the process, is a brilliant one to take. But there are bits before that need to be in place, like the engagement with the subject.
Yes.
And I think the idea that a student comes in focused, particularly on year 0, is a fallacy.
It is.
But even with year 1, I think we get students. I don't think it's just us. I think it's other courses in this university and other universities. We get students coming to us simply because they have been offered a place.
Yeah. I discuss widening participation. I discuss the university's policy on, if they come, they will be offered a place, and the impact that this has on our teaching.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
the course as a whole.
Yeah. It's another evolution in design education.
Absolutely.
I'm sure it's the same with other. I know it's the same with other areas. I mean, we talk about education as a sort of an egalitarian. Everybody can have a go.
Yes, there's a right to it.
And there's a big part of me that applauds that, and yes, I think everybody should have the chance to do something.
It's about reaching potential, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem the problem with that is that it starts to get in the way of elitism, which is obviously a very bad thing, but it actually isn't.
No, it isn't, because everybody does have potential, it's just that they are very different potentials.
It's about expertise, and at the end of the day, a design group isn't going to, a widening participation in a design group isn't going to have the effect that it will do in education. Oh, it's not the same thing.
Industry.
A designer has to earn their keep, as does a radiographer or any one of the other people we've got there. So it's about having skill, talent, all of the things that are unfashionable in education and are sort of like swept away or not discussed.
Yes.
Are actually
key elements.
That's life.
Yeah.
It's how the world is working, and our students have to accept that the same as everybody else's, which is why there will be some that fall by the wayside.
Yeah. And I suppose it's why in my conclusion I discussed how we have to rewrite the Year 0 curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's there that it's where that's the coal face of it, of the widening participation issues that we have. Thanks, Jim.